Another very important aspect of research studies, no matter what approach you take, is the measurement of your variables. Essentially, you know the concepts you want to study, but how do you measure and quantify them? Well, we actually do have to start with concepts and with conceptualization, which is the process of specifying what we mean by a term. For example, let's say we hypothesize that older men are more likely to suffer from myocardial infarction than younger men. All the terms here are pretty easy to conceptualize. By men, we mean male sex, which is usually straightforward to measure. By myocardial infarction, we mean the specific heart condition. By younger, we mean lesser in age. So everything here is pretty concrete. However, it's sometimes a lot harder to conceptualize our terms. For example, if we wanted to know whether time of adoption affects life outcomes for adopted children, we need to specify what we mean by early in life. Is that before age 1? Before age 5? We need to specify well-adjusted. Is that academic success, absence of emotional and behavioral problems, self-rated happiness? And we need to define adopted later. Does that mean simply later compared to the early adopted kids? Or later as in later in adolescence, 17 going on 18? Only when you figured out these terms can you go on to figure out how to measure the concepts. But don't worry, you probably don't need to reinvent the wheel to define the terms in your research questions and hypotheses. Chances are other researchers have already done work on these concepts. This is again where your literature search comes in handy. If you read enough studies on adoption, you'll likely see some trends of what age ranges researchers on this topic have settled on as conventions. Maybe age 0 to 2 is considered very early, and all ages after 13 are considered late, with other stages in between. You'll need to do similar research to find out how other researchers have defined other common themes in health research, such as socioeconomic status, access to healthcare, medication adherence, stigma, and other concepts that you'll surely run across. When you write your research proposal, you'll have to do more than just say that you'll measure socioeconomic status. You'll have to specify what you mean. Do you mean household income? Amount of disposable income? Home values in the neighborhood? Amount of educational attainment? Again, see what other researchers on your topic have done to define SES. Once we have our concepts defined, we need to identify variables that correspond to these concepts. This, in my opinion, is one of the most important steps in research design. Variables are basically the specific aspects of a concept that we define. For example, when we think of socioeconomic status, or SES, it has aspects including household income and disposable income, among others. You don't necessarily always have to have multiple variables to describe a concept, but often it's a good idea to do so because measuring different aspects of the concept may produce different results, giving you a richer understanding of your concept. For example, household income is an important aspect of SES to measure, in part because that's the most common way to do so, and you do want to go with the crowd a bit when choosing variables and measurements, so your study can be interpreted in the context of other studies on the topic. But if you only measure household income, you miss out on important factors that determine SES, like different costs of living. We can't really say that someone making $40,000 a year in Manhattan is at the same SES level as someone who's making $40,000 a year in rural New Hampshire, right? So when you define your variables, try to end up with a set of them that together describe the concept as fully as possible. A good variable is operationalized, or in other words, you've communicated exactly what they are and what is being measured. So for this to be the case, the variable should be concrete and specific. Instead of trying to measure the quality of sleep, which is a good concept, but not a very good variable because it's fairly vague and we don't really know what we mean by quality of sleep, you should try to measure, among other variables, the number of minutes of stage 4 sleep. This is very specific. We're talking about a very specific stage of sleep and a very specific unit of how you're measuring it. A good variable is also measurable. We can measure the number of churchgoers, for example, as an indication of a town's religious adherence, but we can't really measure the amount of spiritual energy in a town. If you know how to do this, please let me know and we'll get you a Nobel Prize. A quick review about variables more generally speaking, since we've been talking about them so much and will be for the next while. There are 3 basic types of variables: independent, dependent, and extraneous or confounding. Independent variables are the ones that you either manipulate, if it's an experimental approach, or hypothesize to be a cause, influencer, or predictor. It's the variable that you begin with. So often in health research, this is the exposure or intervention. For example, the age of adoption is our hypothesized influencer or predictor of later psychological well-being. In this hypothesis, children who were adopted early in life are more well-adjusted than children who are adopted later. So you have your independent variable being the age of adoption. You have relatively more control over either choosing or defining or manipulating the independent variable, since you're starting out with it. Dependent variables are the outcomes. You don't have and shouldn't have any control over these variables, as they are the unknown that you're trying to study. Dependent variables in health research are usually the disease or outcome, but note that it could be the other way around too. Here, the dependent variable is well-adjustedness, or more specifically, psychiatric symptoms. That's the outcome. Note that if you're doing a case control study, for example, you are starting with people that already have, say, schizophrenia versus people who don't. Here, the presence of schizophrenia is actually the independent variable because that's what you choose to define, and you hypothesize that it's a predictor. In this case control approach, you go looking for culprit exposures in the past in these schizophrenia participants because you believe that the current schizophrenia diagnosis predicts a certain exposure history. So here the exposures are actually the dependent variables because this is what you're searching for and you're not really sure what you're going to find. And that's the outcome of your study. Moving on to extraneous or confounding variables, these are the factors that could affect the dependent variable that you're not trying to study. So for example, something other than the age of adoption could be affecting current psychiatric symptoms, such as the children's psychiatric health at birth, before they were ever adopted. In fact, it could be that children with, say, fussier temperaments when they were first born had a harder time being adopted. And these are also the ones who end up having more psychiatric symptoms because of a family history of psychiatric problems, for example. Then here in this case, psychiatric health at birth is an important confounding variable. It can muddy the results and render them very difficult to interpret. A common way to solve this problem is to make sure that your groups, so the early adopted versus late adopted groups, are matched on psychiatric health at birth. So if both groups are equally well adjusted at birth, then the age of adoption is the only other independent variable that could be affecting the psychiatric outcomes. Unless, of course, there are other confounding variables that we haven't thought of. So, see, defining variables is a very important process because even when thinking this through and talking it out loud, you realize that there could be extraneous or confounding variables that we need to control for and need to be aware of. Finally, after you know all of your variables are defined and operationalized, you have to figure out how to measure those variables, right? So for some variables, it's pretty easy to choose a measurement method. If the variable is height, the measurement is number of inches, and you can use a ruler for this. But sometimes it's not as easy. because there are different ways of measuring other variables, such as, say, depression. We could measure this by asking a participant questions in an interview or give them a self-report survey. We could measure it by asking the participant's family to report their observations. We could ask their family doctor. We could ask the participant to report symptoms by remembering how he felt in the past week, or we can have him input his mood at regular or random intervals throughout the week. We can measure levels of stress hormones in the participant's blood serum or use a Fitbit to track the participant's level of activity. Both methods could potentially give us indicators of depression. So, how to choose? Well, here are some guiding principles. The measurement should be as direct as possible in most cases. If you can measure someone's height, measure it instead of consulting their driver's license or asking them to tell you. If you can measure someone's exercise behavior by using a Fitbit, for example, measure it instead of asking them to report how much they ran or walked. If you cannot measure something directly without asking the participant, such as mood, you can still improve the directness of the measure by asking them to report the current mood at intervals so that they're recording throughout the day, instead of asking them to remember how they were feeling throughout the past week in retrospect. Basically, the fewer connectors in the game of telephone, the better, each connector being a degree of separation from the thing being measured to the numbers that you're ending up with. Another principle is to include multiple types of measures, which can give you richer information and cover all aspects of the concept you're trying to study. For example, if you're measuring ADHD symptoms in a 7-year-old, of course ask the kid himself whether he has a hard time sitting still, but also ask the parents and ask the teachers whether he has a hard time sitting still, because you may find that the kid is unaware of his own fidgeting and is underreporting his amount of fidgeting, or the kid only fidgets at school but not at home, or that maybe everyone is in agreement that he fidgets. In any case, having information from multiple informants gives you a more valid and confident result. If you're measuring someone's insomnia, ask them to keep a sleep diary, which is a subjective measure, and use a more objective measure, such as polysomnography. Not only will you have more confidence in your measures, you may find interesting patterns of discrepancy, such as the person thinking that they sleep a lot less than they actually do. This is relevant actually to both diagnosis and treatment of insomnia. Lastly, I again urge you to see what other researchers have used as measurement tools. In fact, this is maybe the first thing you should do. Instead of reinventing the wheel and making up a self-report questionnaire about anxiety, see what is usually used to measure anxiety. You will see that the popular questionnaires are usually already validated. That is, research has been done specifically to see if the questionnaire makes sense and measures what it's supposed to measure. So don't reinvent the wheel. See what other people have done. It's actually cool to follow the crowd sometimes in science. To summarize and review this part of the module, conceptualization and measurement are very important aspects of designing your research study. To begin with, you must conceptualize what you want to understand in your research study. These concepts are then specified into variables, which should represent as best as possible the concepts and be operationalized. This means they will be specific, concrete, and measurable. And speaking of measurable, lastly, you will choose the measurements that will ultimately capture all aspects of the concepts that you began with. You probably notice that at each step, things get more specific and concrete. In your research proposal, you'll have to be very specific and concrete. You'll have to name, for example, the measures you will use. If you will use a questionnaire, which one? What is it called? If you are designing your own questionnaire, you must justify why you are doing so instead of using an existing one, and must provide all of the questions and scoring instructions in an appendix. If you will use equipment to measure, say, skin conductance, pupil response, blood cortisol level, anything like that, you must describe in detail the process of collecting the data, including what equipment you will use, made by what company, etc. Essentially, when I read the method section of your proposal, I should know exactly what materials are needed to conduct the study and theoretically be able to go out and acquire everything. Best of luck!